My last video on the topic of Tankies was without a doubt the longest script I've ever worked on. Roughly, I spent maybe 150 hours working on it since last September. As such, many of the parts were cut out of it, so I'm going to be going over some of the deleted scenes, the DVD extras, as it were. Now, the main, biggest one that I cut was the topic of Maoists. When you bring in Maoism, by which I mean the movement that began in the 80s and 90s after the Cold War and predominantly exhibited in Turkey, Nepal, Philippines, India, Peru, etc., it tends to complicate the definitions people bring up. Whilst they agree with a lot of ML principles, they also foundationally reject many of them too. And it's not just on a pick or choose basis, it runs pretty deep, best I know. So just to give you an example, they don't believe Cuba to be socialist, nor ever, mainly because of its financial nature with the USSR, nor for that matter any present-day country, China, Vietnam, Laos, etc., etc. So many people pointing to the Naxals or the MPA as evidence of ML orgs today actually doing stuff, right, those are Maoists, not MLs. They're not the same. You'd drop them in a heartbeat if you found out what they think of you. The splintering of it was very much one of, your ideas are outdated, we're not going to ride with you anymore, we're going to go form our own thing and we're actually going to get somewhere, says the theory. And I suppose that speaks to the nature of Maoism in its current form, is that it's very much so focused on the future, rather than constantly wrestling with the past, which I find tends to be an integral part of what we call tanky discourse. Then again, there's no shortage of Maoist tendencies that are quite cult-like, and many Maoists I've seen do justify the annexation of Tibet, so who knows? All I can say is that when you look at Maoism properly, if you treat it how it actually is, it definitely complicates tanky discussion quite fundamentally once you look into it, if, that is, you wish to include them in that canon. Once more, I'm not a Maoist, but I just hope that you can see why I find this stuff so interesting, so juicy. The next thing I discarded was Trotsky. I often find that when Marxist-Leninists talk about Trotsky, it's never really about the ideology or the ideas. The main thing with Trotsky is he was wrong because he was plotting an overthrow and therefore he had to go. There is very much this sort of boogeyman that haunts the ghost of Trotsky to this day. I can defo attest that when I first asked people why they found Trotsky to be bad, many people pointed to very silly things, like Naplesgate. If you don't know, whilst en route to Denmark one day, Trotsky stopped off in fascist Italy. That's the thing that you're normally told. The idea that you're supposed to gain from this, on face value, is Trotsky in Italy? Why was he there? What's he doing there? I thought he was a socialist internationalist. Now he's hanging around with fascists. These accusations are so dense. There's absolutely no effort made to think about the context, the time he was there, all the technicalities involved. No, you're just told to think, what context could there possibly be for a supposed communist being allowed into a fascist country? Well, the context is, he was there for a couple of hours whilst refueling the ship, they went out, they had a look around, had the cops watching them the entire time, and then they left. That's it. Politics is not a video game. Now that's a relatively mundane point. I've also found at least one Marxist-Leninist claim that not only was Trotsky, being picked simply a fact of history, but rather that no, it was a good thing that Trotsky was picked. The reason being, if he had lived longer, Trotskyism would have been more prolific. And because many former Trots later became neocons, like Irving Kristol, neoconservatism would have been much stronger. We're certainly still Marxists, aren't we? Of course, that's not to reify Trotsky, quite the opposite. In my research and looking around at all these things, it's funny how many similarities I noticed. The Trotsky complex, I suppose, that sometimes happens with some of his defenders. Whilst Trotsky's later movements might have not had many revolutionary examples, Leon himself did, and it's telling when you see some of the responses that are made. Many like to present Trotsky as this sort of underdog who was fighting the good fight abroad against Stalin, But just replacing Holodomor and Katyn with things like the Black Army and Kronstadt, you can start to see some similar apologia, and it's quite glaring. And just like with Marxism-Leninism, there's even some exaggerating of the anti-Semitism by said people, or even allegations of fascist leadership, respectively. If people are wondering about, Stalin copying Trotsky's ideas, let me just go into that quite quickly. Trotsky was the leader of the left opposition during the 1920s, and he was in favour of the eventual liquidation of the kulaks, and yeah, it's a whole other story. The right opposition, namely Bukharin, were more in favour of basically letting it slide, as it were. Oddly enough, after Trotsky went on his forced vacation, Stalin basically took the opposition's idea after he saw the threat. Now, Trots often tend to say that Trotsky wanted to do it more gradually or more participatorily rather than the rapid way in which it occurred, yet, given the state of affairs, and I think you can really just see this for yourself in some of the stuff that Trotsky did do, I don't see that working out. Given Trotsky's record for when these sorts of situations happened, it only further confirms that confidence. You can say whatever you want about Trotsky as a thinker. I think he's probably got some pretty good stuff to say. Generally speaking, I consider what has come out from him on the world stage not to be a whole lot better than yours truly. If the best you can really offer me these days is basically middle-aged people with a rolling door of uni students handing out newspapers, a bit of entryism, and some boring ego-boosting talks, then, yeah, you don't really give me much confidence, I'm afraid. But I guess he did get off with Frida Kahlo, so that's got to count for something. Also, just a very small point on Malcolm X. I've seen some people claim that nobody claims that X was a communist. They do. They have. All of the quotes in this video were from actual accounts, in case you're wondering. I should have included the ones from Malcolm X, but let's just say I got a bit lazy after hour 157 of editing, so forgive me. So, with all that out of the way, we can now talk a little bit more about the meat of the discussion, the Hungarian Revolution itself. If you are still wondering about the claim that the Hungarian Revolution was in fact led by fascists, I can tell you now in good logic that that claim is unfounded. I don't really care if your granddaddy was a Soviet guard. It's just a party line repeated ad nauseum and popularized mostly by one very badly sourced book. A book that was discredited at the time by communists themselves. If you want to argue for wide-scale pogroms, well, that's on you, not me. But from my brief research in a country with over 3,000 settlements, there was a small handful, less than maybe 0.5% of all towns reporting anti-Semitic attacks. Roughly in total, we get a few dozen, maybe up to 100 anti-Jewish attacks that were recorded during the time, ranging in severity widely. One notable name that's often brought up in this discussion is Bela Karali, who fought with the Nazis and later served as the leader of the revolt of the National Guard during the Revolution. Karali is an odd fellow, needless to say. However, it is also worth mentioning he was declared fit for work by the government. He was actually allowed to join the Communist Party, and a minor point, he did actually even get honours from Israel. Probably not the greatest guy, but I barely rank him as a big old Nazi. What people probably won't tell you, or what people don't probably even know, is who his deputy was. This guy, Sandor Kapaksky, a Hungarian resistance fighter, communist, and die-hard anti-fascist. Sandor also received honours from Israel. Strange how all these Nazis keep on getting praise from Zionists. Now, I can go into sort of the long details, but frankly that's boring. You can read them up yourself. I've listed the main reading list down below if you want to read that. Frankly, this is really all that you need to ask yourself. A simple logic question. Were the leaders fascist? Considering the wealth of evidence showcasing worker solidarity amongst the rioters, that there were Jews on both sides. Many of the most famous rebels were Jews, Erika Schelles, Laszlo Nikolsberg, István Anyel, etc. Sorry if I've butchered any of those names, I'm a filthy Indo-European. The fact that nearly a decade-long socialist government had purged away most of the old haughty conservative elements, or was it convenient to blame fascist elements after your country has just suffered such a very evident popular discontent. How else do you continue as a government if so? And we don't need to look very far for other historical examples of this. The Timișoara revolt in 1989's Romania, what did Nick blame as the cause for the revolt? Hooligans. Hooliganism. He soon found out that that was not true. And now we see Putin using this same denazification line from decades ago. It's quite telling, don't you think? And if even by some magic I've missed something and the brunt of the rebels really were fascists, well, you still have the Prague Spring, which is where the word begins its growing popularity. We don't tend to find much written documentation of the word prior to the 1970s. One point that stands out to me in Sage's refutation to is that at one point fully believed that the Minister of the Interior, Laszlo Rajk, was a Titoist spy and Western infiltrator, and wrote in defense of his noose. But after 1956 and Kadar had assumed power, one of Rakosi's enemies, Herb changed his mind on this and understood that the Reich show trial was a show trial. But Herbert Apthker never really acknowledges anywhere the elements that led him and many other communists to believe outright lies. There's one thing in changing your mind, we all do it, wink wink, but if you were just to change your mind on one thing without acknowledging the process for why you were led into that direction in the first place, you face the danger of simply replacing one set of superficials with another. So, these are lines that have been inherited, as it were, that manifests itself in what we call today modern Marxism-Leninism. It's an interesting thing to think about. You can have that discussion about who is a Tankie and who isn't, but whether or not one person's individual views might differ from this person's, or that person's, or the majority opinion, if you string out these views based on what we know happened in reality, do they contradict themselves? And if they do, then ultimately what has been manifested quickly falls apart. I've had to come to understand that myself. In many ways, one can ask, what exactly is Marxism-Leninism today without Hungary? I think one major reason why conspiratorial thinking is higher across many ML disciplines is very much because sooner or later it would all fall apart. I do have some sympathies for some groups. Red Fight Back seems to be quite promising, but my confidence is quite pessimistic. Prove me wrong, kids. Now, when the war in Ukraine kicked off earlier this year, the attitude from a certain side definitely reaffirmed what I'd already been writing. So there wasn't really much shock there. If anything, we actually got a re-emergence of the historical definition of tanky. But what was a little bit annoying was the way in which lots of apparent leftists viewed the situation in a, to be desired light that was, kind of disappointing because I really felt like a proper look went missing. Not naming any names. Firstly, NATO is not a defensive alliance. We have ample evidence of that. If you want to claim that it was done for the right reasons, go for it. But don't claim that it's defensive. Frankly, and this is I think where looking beyond mere descriptors comes really handy, even if an organization claims itself as such, you should be highly skeptical of that. Lefties should not be so naive as to believe that this is a benevolent force and certainly not the biggest cop in the room. Imagine for a moment that Turkey were to have a socialist revolution. Do you really think that all of their NATO neighbours would just sit around twiddling their thumbs? Next is this idea that the US uses soft power and is a lesser evil in world discourse. If you wonder why Russian imperialism seems so much more visceral and blasé than the Americans, apart from the obvious fact of media control, it's because America had the privilege of 2 oceans of distance between it and other world powers. It had basically homogenized enough people under its control, and it didn't need to invade its neighbors quite simply because it didn't need to. Frankly, it had already done it. We just don't call that its neighbors, we just call that manifest destiny. It can be said, yes, of course you can appear to have the moral high ground once you've already won, or if it's not geographically convenient. I don't want people to be confusing a country doing a thing differently with them being somehow worse or better. If you've ever been in the unlucky position of being in a police interrogation room, you know that in the 21st century West they don't play hardball anymore. Instead, they try to be your friend. But isn't that so much better than getting whacked around in a Russian prison, right? That is again not me justifying their expansion, that's simply me stating what imperialist powers do. Go figure. I think it's best that we sort of get through as much of this BS as possible. Russia getting into trouble with the West? That's Russia's problem. Yes, absolutely, defo. One can also ask the question, why should Russia serve under the hegemony of the West anyway? And for that matter, why us to Russia? If you're more liberal inclined, then of course the West is better by default. Right, so your answer is already made up. But if you're a socialist, we know full well that there's a darker subtext to all of this, and that these are not really our wars. And that's me being generous, actually, in claiming that America doesn't try to annex its neighbours. Just to reiterify that I'm not partisan on this, I have been very suspicious towards the amount of people on the left who just portray Ukraine as some unique Nazi-infested hellhole, or zeroing in on non-systemic attacks during a state conflict as emblematic of Ukraine as a whole. Are there Nazis in Ukraine's military? Sure. But I don't think that this presentation based on a relatively small group has been particularly warranted. I, far more than many others, know the perils that come with presenting isolated issues as a grander systemic thing. It is most definitely a pathological reaction. I can't imagine the same perspective being thrust upon recipients of any US invasion. We would rightfully point out that it is demonization of a country that is currently under enormous attack in order to stoke the seeds of doubt, no matter how real the truths are. But when this happens in Ukraine, however, then suddenly all that skepticism is thrown out the window. I have seen some people argue that Russian imperialism is necessary for them due to their conditions as a lesser power, whereas American imperialism being the big dog, that's on them. They consciously choose whether to take that action or not. The problem is imperialism is necessary for all states if given that opportunity to keep the process of abundance going. Given time, they cannot consciously stop being imperialists so much as humans can consciously stop breathing. I personally find that argument kind of falls flat. Sorry to linger on this, but I didn't really get to go much into it in my last video, and I always found that much of the popular leftist discourse that wasn't pro-Russia or adjacent to Russia was being taken up by more, sort of democratically socialist inclined types, the types, not naming any names in particular, of course, but if you see anyone with a strangely Pax Americana sentiment behind their words, approach with caution is all I can say. They are milkshake ducks waiting to happen. I spoke about W.E.B. Du Bois' Anti-Americanism and how it led him to believe that Japan was a benevolent actor. People did give the context that this was due to Will being in a prison house of nations and was highly subjected within it. This is very true. If you read up his stuff and many other black socialists like Paul Robeson, you will definitely get the idea that they were living in a country that wanted them dead, that anything was better than that. Indeed, it is also the reason why one James Baldwin separated himself from America.
Because he looks the way he looks, and for no other reason. For no other reason. He could be dead in the morning. That isn't true of you or any of you. It's true of him.
As much as this context is good, it doesn't necessarily mean that the analysis that came out of that was. Indeed, it is very true that the modern anti-Deutsch movement in Germany came out of the context of being descendants of quite literally the butchers of Europe. But this doesn't necessarily make their end argument particularly coherent or proper. What amounts, in the end, is a mishmash of sentiments with simply anything but Deutschland in mind. They end up unconditionally supporting Israel, praising the bombing of Dresden, and making solidarity calls with Milosevic. Yeah, I know, right? Supporting Israel and Milosevic. Usually it's just one or the other. It's a mess. It really is. With regards to anti-Americanism, some have stated that there is really an issue because America, and by its proxy Europe, is in its scale quite possibly the most destructive force in history and for any hope of socialism. And in that court, I would agree. That is why I myself do not discount the threat posed by America on the world stage, and I do highlight again that Pax Americana impulse that many lefties tend to deliberately or accidentally push. However, there are, like I like to say, limits to this, and if you don't see them, then you're being a bit silly. Like I've said before, you shouldn't allow yourself to just be taken down this hole. Many times in my experience, I've seen people bring up atrocities, very real atrocities happening in many other places, not within the context of American discussion or anything like that, simply as a fact, and the response is a knee-jerk, well, that's not as bad as America. It's that very impulse, that pining to go America bad, that clouds perceptions of the rest of the world. I really recommend Sophie's video on the topic of conspiracy for further information into that.
Again, the people Dora is discussing here have a documented history of helping to manufacture consent for American imperialism, and in the case of these gas attacks, that's literally what they're doing as well, but what they're saying doesn't have to be false for them to be using it toward imperialist ends. To extend the comparison to COVID, lots of COVID conspiracy theories point to, for example, heightened police powers as proof that the pandemic was manufactured to allow governments to implement authoritarian policies. The observation is true, the policies are real, it doesn't require the crisis to be manufactured for it to be true.
Many people brought him up. Gaddafi is often held up as a strong man against America. But Gaddafi was also highly likely to be responsible in aiding the crushing of socialist efforts. Namely, everybody's favourite, Thomas Sankara. He was also instrumental in the creation of certain Islamist groups and the repression of non-Arab Libyan culture. None of this justifies the biggest cop in the room taking him out. You should be against that. It only led to many, many, many more problems. However, there is more to this discussion than meets the eye, and it doesn't justify this 1D view of him either. As well as this, it can also cement rigidity in a specific time and place, even when the rest of the world moves on. As China's influence begins to grow, in time we will probably see again another shake-up of geopolitical situations more and more. Saudi Arabia, a long-time card used by us lefties as a proxy of the United States, is now actually a larger trading partner with China. Only time will tell what happens once China's golden age runs out of steam. I can also only hypothesize that ideological anti-Americanism is part and parcel as to why, in the eyes of some left pundits, China can do whatever the hell it wants. I will also say that my point about anti-Americanism tends to be the foundational hallmark of this sort of thing point. If you've noticed, patriotic socialism has since become quite a thing, springing out from many ML-adjacent currents. And arguably that defines itself in the spirit of America. Of course, a highly mythologized and nostalgic interpretation of the American working class, but it does make me wonder if anti-Americanism is truly as foundational as I made it out to be, or rather is it just one side of a coin springing out from something else? Something perhaps about basing your personality around arbitrary historical political musings. I will frankly let you sort that out because I'm too tired on this discussion right now. I overlook these people primarily because I think they're fucking stupid, but only time will tell if they're just a drop in the ocean. If history has been anything to go by, they probably are. No Heroes Publishing asks, is using imagery or symbols or callbacks to something necessarily viewed to be as problematic? Well, I think like anything, it's context-based. Sites like Soviet Visuals do nothing but display old memorabilia from Soviet times, and yet there's nothing really super political about their page. It's just simply a fact that there's a great nostalgia for that time and place. If my history does me any good, even Harry Brewis likes them, as do I. Equally, there can be a lot to be found in Japanese culture, but weebs are a thing. And arguably now, sheebs are a thing. There's nothing wrong with enjoying aesthetics of a different time period that are no longer around. Probably, maybe some more than others. If, however, you make that your personality, then it gets problematic. Because it's clear that you're not solely interested in it as just a little niche, but rather you're adding some kind of political dimension that gets in the way. I guess the question you really need to ask is, why are weeaboos so cringe? Being into Japanese stuff by itself isn't the problem. It's the special hell that results when Japanese fixation combines with obnoxiousness, immaturity, and ignorance that makes one a weeaboo. And that's why those people suck. I don't mean any ill will if you're in the YCL, but you're probably better off spending your energy elsewhere. This is not very helpful to your development. So like last time, I did a book recommendation, and I shall do so again. Now, all honesty, I haven't finished this book, and I probably should finish it before recommending it, but hey-ho. Joyful Militancy, particularly Chapter 5, and it addresses basically some stuff that coincidentally came across as very complimentary to what I was writing, so I'm very glad to whoever I found this through. Namely, the topic that they talk about is rigid radicalism. It's written from a more anarchist perspective, but I did find that the basis of the phrase tends to go further than just the main audience that they're talking about. It is the pleasure of feeling more radical than others and the worry about not being radical enough. The sad comfort of sorting unfolding events into dead categories. The vigilant perception of errors and complicities in oneself and others. The anxious posturing on social media and the highs of being liked and the lows of being ignored. The suspicion and resentment felt in the presence of something new. The way curiosity feels naive and condescension feels right. But no, seriously, whilst I haven't finished this, I must say from what I have read of it, after years of feeling quite bitter and pessimistic towards the progress on the left, it was quite refreshing to see something that was a bit more optimistic and hopeful, and, also whilst being firmly grounded in actual radical efforts and not just being some swing towards reformism and all that. So, yeah, again, it was very refreshing to see. Give it a read. Maybe it's good, maybe it's not. I don't know. But anyway, bye for now. As with all of my videos before, this will be my final one.